in advance of tonight's presentation, I emailed to Lonnie 2 questionnaires, and they are reprinted in your awesome 11 by 17 portfolio broadsheet for today. Unfortunately, the way the scales are supposed to work is that there are supposed to be very faintly, but apparently too faintly, numbers in each of the boxes, such that if you go through and you score yourself on, and this is the grit scale, so you're supposed to go merrily through the 10 statements, checking off whether these do or do not apply to you for each one. Then if you add up the numbers and divide by 10, it used to be dividing by 8, but I realized that human beings do not like to divide by 8. So you just have to move the decimal point and you get your grit score. And then there's a little grid also on your broadsheet that lets you essentially rank yourself relative to a random sample of American adults. You know, what percentile grit do you fall into? So let me just say that the items that sound gritty are the items that are scored where 5 is very much like me. The items that when you answer them, for example, I've been obsessed with a certain idea or project for a short time but later lost interest, that sound ungritty. If you say, yeah, that's very much like me, that scored 1 as the highest number. So I think you can maybe figure it out from looking at this graphic and then putting that together with what you're doing. Now, by no means do you have to score yourself for grit at this point in the talk, but if you'd like to, I put this in there because I think it gives you a really granular view of what I'm now going to be talking about, of course, which can get somewhat abstract unless you have something tangible like this. So that's that. Do you have a question in the back? Yeah. Yeah, let me read you the items, and maybe in the meanwhile the audio will get worked out. If it doesn't get worked out, by the way, I'm happy to just carry this, and I'll do two-handed. Okay, so for those of you who have eyes like mine, which is to say that you can't see anything, the items that are scored where very much like me is 5, and then 4, 3, 2, 1 are setbacks don't discourage me, I don't give up easily, I am an extremely hard worker, I finish whatever I begin, I'm diligent, I never give up, I've achieved a goal that took years of work. So those items, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, very much like me all the way down to not like me at all. And then for the items which are the other items, which I didn't read, they're scored the opposite way. So, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay? So again, not essential, so I'm not going to dwell on this too long. And for sure, you can ask me questions about this, after the talk. But for those of you who want a PDF version of a grit scale that you can give to your children and talk about over the breakfast table, there's also a PDF on my website, not quite set up in this easy self-scoring version, but fairly straightforward. Just for the sake of clarity, because we realized when we got here that the scoring was not printed correctly or wasn't visible to you, let me just say that the next questionnaire is also 10 items, and this is the second topic that I'm going to be addressing tonight, which is self-control. So you not only can figure out how gritty you are tonight, you can figure out how self-controlled you are. And again, the items that sound like they would be scored highly for self-control are scored highly for self-control. So for example, I refuse things that are bad for me, even if they are fun. I'm good at resisting temptation. People would say that I have very strong self-discipline. Those items, you score yourself 5 if you are very, much like me in this column. 4, 3, 2, 1, and then all of the other items, like I often act without thinking through the alternatives, I get distracted easily, I have a hard time breaking bad habits, those are scored the opposite way. So 1 is very much like me, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. Okay? For that scale, I don't have a large sample of adults who've taken it, so I can't give you, this is how self-controlled you are relative to other Americans. But I did want to give you a sense of what these 2 different personality traits or character strengths are. And again, feel free to ignore the scales, free to take them afterwards, but there you have them. Okay? Any other questions of clarification for that? Okay, thank you very much. I really didn't intend to start with technical problems and a clarification of the survey. What I really wanted to do was start with William James. I developed this talk in part for a talk that I had to give at Harvard, which was my alma mater, and I was appropriately anxious and insecure. So I thought, what kind of clever way will I have to set the context for what I'm going to tell the department members for the school where I was a student. And I knew that the talk was going to be held in William James Hall, named after possibly Harvard University's most famous psychologist, who wrote an essay in 1906 about achievement. So I'm going to frame the remarks really using William James's own words. In 1906, in this essay called The Energies of Men, he says, compared with what we ought to be, we are only half awake. We are making use of only a small part of our possible mental and physical resources. Men the world over possess amounts of resource which only exceptional individuals push to their extremes of use. It's a long essay. I encourage you to read it. And what William James then goes on to elaborate is case study after case study of individuals in his own personal and professional acquaintance who rather fall short of what they could be doing. Rather remarkable given the kinds of people that William James presumably was rubbing elbows with, right? How far we fall short of our potential even among the elite. And he later goes on to say that really all of psychology as a discipline could be structured around two very simple questions. What are talents and abilities? And what are the things that unleash them? And I would say that for the last century, this country and other countries have spent a lot of energy measuring and understanding talent and ability. Is the child going to go to the gifted and talented program, or did they not get into the gifted and talented program? What's their SAT score? What is their specific learning disability? What are their potential resources that we should capitalize on? I'd argue that as a country, we've spent far less attention until recently on the second part of the equation, as William James put it, all the things that unleash those resources. And that's what I really want to talk to you about tonight. There's another Will that I named the talk after, who's a lot more fun to think about, and that's Will Smith. Let's see if I can get this video to work. Oh, is the sound on? Okay, the sound's not working. I promise I'll start. Or are you going to do it from there? Let's see if we can hear him. You can tell he's emphatic, whatever he's saying. I'm happy to paraphrase, but he's so much more fun to listen to than me. No? Should I just paraphrase? There we go. Okay. So what Will Smith is emphatically saying behind me, in a way that is much more humorous than I could ever be, is the only thing about me that's different, really the only thing, is that I'm not willing to get off the treadmill. Then his interviewer says, "What do you mean by that?" And he said, life is a treadmill, right? And you can get on it and I can get on it, and you can be more talented than me, you can be faster than me, you can be smarter than me, you can have it on me in 9 different categories. And then he, by the way, says you can be sexier than me. I'm not sure if that's possible. But anyway, he said, but there is one thing, I am not getting off that treadmill. 2 things are going to happen, one or the other. Either you get off first, or I'm going to die trying, right? And it's an interesting thing because it's not just in this interview. He actually wrote an entire rap called The Treadmill, and it's really, life is a treadmill. How far and how long are you willing to run? But he's interviewed all over the place, and consistently that's his message, that I'm not somebody for whom things came remarkably easy, but I am someone who's willing to pursue what I'm doing in a doggedly tenacious way. So that sets the context, if I can get this straight, for Francis Galton's remarks. Francis Galton, many of us wouldn't recognize the name. We would recognize the name of his more famous half-cousin, Charles Darwin. They came from an eminent British family, and Francis Galton was personally obsessed with success. And he arguably, more than 100 years before Outliers, wrote the first serious systematic look at success, the first serious systematic research project on who is and who is not successful in life. And what Francis Galton says after interviewing and biographing eminent individuals across as many walks of life as he could think of, judges, scientists, mathematicians, wrestlers, for whatever reason he was a little idiosyncratic in his selection. He said it really kind of comes down to three things. It's the trifecta of talent, or as he puts it here, ability, and William James certainly made allusion to that, and then two other elements that are clearly not talent factors. There is zeal, which let me translate 19th century language to 21st century verbiage. What he means here is sustained passion or interest in something. And then the capacity for persistent hard labor. And when he mailed this book in an advance copy to his cousin, Charles wrote back to him saying that he largely agreed and was actually convinced in a way, because when Charles read this, his initial hypothesis was that really men didn't differ at all in intellect, that frankly it was only differences in zeal and hard work that gave rise to differences in achievement. And Charles Darwin is elsewhere quoted as saying that he did not find himself to be any kind of scientific genius for whom insights came easily, but he did characterize himself as somebody who had true passion, sustained over decades for singular scientific questions, and then the arduous, sometimes thankless hard work to go with it. I was showing this to the kids today at North Shore and explaining to them that this is what handwriting looks like. If they have never seen it before, they might want to know. Okay, so that brings us, fast forward now to 20th century and 21st century research. So what have we figured out about the science of success, the psychology of achievement? I'm going to borrow here from the work of one of my collaborators, Anders Ericsson. For those of you, and let's do a show of hands, how many of you either read or intended to read Outliers? Guessing you can look around, so that's well over half of you. Which doesn't surprise me, given the audience here. So much of the book Outliers, which is a fun read, is based on the research of Anders Ericsson. So who is Anders Ericsson? He is a Swedish psychologist who now resides at Florida State University, and he is the world expert on experts. So what Anders does is he studies people who are world class in as many different domains as he can get his hands on. So he studies chess masters, and he studies people like Adam Kim, and he studies mathematicians, and he studies World Cup soccer players, and Olympic swimmers, and famous radiologists. And in all of these studies, Anders is looking for general universal laws of skill development. He wants to understand how people get better at what they do, no matter what it is that they do. And a summary of his research is here in this graph, which is actually from his own work. And on the x-axis, you have age in years, since you've actually engaged in the endeavor. And then on the y-axis, you have skill. And this does seem to be a skill acquisition curve which holds true in the many diverse domains which Anders studies. And one thing to note about this, and this is one of Anders' strong claims, is that nobody, not the most talented individual, is born knowing really any complex human skill. It's all acquired during the lifetime, which is what makes us different from horses who can, born 1 second, running the next second. Human beings are not like that. For most of our complex skills, whatever it is that you do for a living, you were not born knowing how to do that. So you had to acquire skill over time. And one of the key insights of Anders' work is that it's not just experience, it's something very special called deliberate practice. So when I was reading the work and I was trying to understand what he was saying, I thought about my own experience, and I thought, well, Anders' claim here is that thousands of hours accumulated over, a decade or more of experience, of practice, lead reliably to skill development, right? Practice leads to skill. And then I thought to myself, how is it that I go running every day, right? Not for a very long time, but pretty consistently. And I've been doing that for more than this 10-year period. And that dotted line called international level of performance is definitely not me. In fact, I haven't gotten a second faster since I started running. So I called Anders and I asked him that straightforward question. And he started asking me hard questions about what I did. And I told him that I run the same route every time. And when I get back, it's always the same time. And he said, well, have you ever tried to run faster? No. Have you ever tried, like doing interval workouts where, first you run fast and no. Have you ever tried to run longer? No. Have you ever tried essentially to do anything other than the same darn thing over and over again? And I realized no, and then he said, well, there you have your answer. So deliberate practice is not just showing up. It's not just having years of experience. It's not the guarantee that the veteran teacher is going to be a better teacher than someone with less experience, because it's the kind of practice that's accumulated. And how he defines deliberate practice is, very specifically, working on the edge of your abilities, where challenges exceed skill, on a very, very focal element of your performance. Not, well, today I'm going to try to get better, but today I'm trying to work on some very specific facet, right? And then feedback. So I know how I did. I tried to do something I couldn't do, very specific, right? Not just in general, but, for example, I'm a swimmer and I'm just working on the angle that my left hand makes on entry into the water. Not in general, I want to get a better stroke, but really specific. I do it, I get feedback somehow from my coach, from watching myself, from my speed. The feedback is key. And then, and this is the part I think students don't like, repetition. You have to do the same thing all over again the next day, right? And it's that kind of deliberate practice that reliably leads to skill development. So that was interesting, and I think that explained a lot to me. So then I asked Anders, well, why is it that if it's that special kind of practice, which I understand now is not the same thing as plain old experience, well, why aren't we all better and better at everything we do? Why am I so disappointed in humanity so much of the time? Like, why can't people do their jobs better? And why don't people seem to be coming to work with that, leaning forward into the wind inclination to get better and better every day? And then he said, well, we don't know the answer to the question yet, but in our preliminary work, interestingly, on musicians, the kind of practice that I'm talking about is highly effortful. It requires 100% concentration, and it's not fun. So you're screwing up. You're making mistakes. When he studied figure skaters, deliberate practice is all the times that they were trying things that they couldn't do, and therefore were landing on the ice more than half the time. It's not fluent. It's not flow. It's not effortless. It's not, I'm in control and this feels good. In fact, in his studies of world-class athletes and musicians, the maximum number of hours of deliberate practice that are regularly put in day after day is about 4, right? And these are the most motivated individuals. For sure, they play for longer and they do other things. They lift weights, they play with other people. But when they are in that intense, on the edge, doing exactly what they can't do, it's hard, it hurts, 4 hours a day, 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year, 10 years, it adds up to about 10,000 hours of deliberate practice on average. And Malcolm Gladwell called that the 10,000 hour rule in Outliers when he summarized the research. There is somebody else who came up with the same rule from a very different perspective, interestingly. I'm quite sure that she was not reading the social science literature when she said, this is Martha Graham, the great American dancer and choreographer, it takes about 10 years to make a mature dancer. Now, I put the This I Believe link on the slide, but it's easily Googleable. It's a good, 2-minute essay if you want to click on it and listen to it with your children. She says, it takes about 10 years to make a mature dancer. Dancing appears glamorous easy, delightful. But the path to the paradise of that achievement is no easier than any other. There is fatigue so great that the body cries even in its sleep. There are times of complete frustration. There are daily small deaths. And when I showed this slide today at North Shore to the middle school students and the high school students, I paused here. Now, most of the students are not ballet dancers, so it's not directly relevant, but I wonder how many of them have looked around in their math class, in their writing class, and saw some other child for whom they would say, for that child, it's easy, it's effortless, it's graceful. For me, it is frustrating, I'm crying, I am so tired, and I have to keep doing this. But not for him, but that's true for me. And I think that's what I meant, Lonnie alluded to this, by this idea of pluralistic ignorance, which is a well-known psychological concept, and it's basically the following. It's possibly true that everybody is under the same misimpression, but we sort of reinforce it in each other. So we might all be wrong about how much effort it really takes to get that good at anything. But because we have this illusion which is perpetuated and everyone is sort of believing in talent and gifts and natural ability, and particularly when this kind of performance is the kind of thing that we show each other. Right? So the hours and hours of difficult practice when you're screwing up and you're feeling frustrated, that's something we tend not to show other people. So we show other people things that seem effortless from the outside, but we're only kind of sharing with each other that little slice of us. And I think for young people in particular, the pernicious influence is this, that they look around, everybody else is sort of like, oh, it wasn't so hard, I'm not crying, life is good. That reinforces it and that makes them feel like they're the exception, not the rule. So I wanted to tell them that, take it from Martha Graham, we're all crying in our sleeps at some point, and it's hard really for all of us. And this brings us to grit, and this is where Anders and I started to collaborate, because I wanted to know why is it that some children and some grown-ups spend more hours of deliberate practice in whatever it is that they have chosen to do. What enables you to do this difficult, arduous kind of work that's thankless over time, that occasionally is not rewarded by progress, but in fact setbacks and so forth. And the concept of grit is actually something which you now have a little bit of a feel for, having looked at the items. It has two facets. It has the idea of being really abiding and loyal in your interests over time. And then the second part of grit is essentially being persistent in your effort over time. So it's looking at stamina in two dimensions over longer and longer periods of time, depending on who you're talking about. When you're talking about an 8-year-old or a 9-year-old, a 10-year-old in the National Spelling Bee, what a long period of time may be is months or a couple of years. When you're talking about an adult, like Charles Darwin or someone who's actually chosen something, now we're talking about years and decades. But the idea is, can you maintain a focused interest and effort toward that goal over longer and longer periods of time? I'm going to walk you through a couple of research findings that I think are of potential interest, and then hopefully you'll be able to keep mental note of the things that you want me to follow up on and elaborate on in the Q&A. At the National Spelling Bee, about 280 kids are selected from across the country, having won their school spelling bee and their regional spelling bee, and sometimes a larger spelling bee than that. And when I saw the documentary Spellbound, which I highly recommend, I wondered to myself, who wins these things? Are these kids, just gifted verbal geniuses for whom spelling words comes miraculously easy, or is it something else? So I contacted the director of the National Spelling Bee, Paige Kimball, who herself is a spelling bee champion, and actually corrected my spelling in one of my emails, I'm sorry to embarrass to say. And it was deliberate practice for me, so I learned from it. And I asked her, do you know who wins the National Spelling Bee? And she agreed that she did not, and also agreed to let me survey these kids prior to their actually going to the national finals, right? So right after they had been selected, but a few months before they actually went to Washington, D.C. to compete. And what did we find? We found two things. First, we found that the grittier kids were more likely to win in the end. And we found that twice in a row. We studied these kids for 2 years in a row. The second thing we found is that the kinds of things that kids did to get better at spelling could be categorized into 3 different categories. There's deliberate practice, which I told you about, doing things like spelling words that they had consistently misspelled over and over again, vertically on a piece of paper. Looking at word roots, especially word roots that they didn't find especially intrinsically interesting. Interestingly, this deliberate practice tends to be done alone in solitude. And again, there's this element that we're seeing here. When we're doing things that are really hard, that are really confusing, that are really effortful, that take all of our concentration, where we're frequently making errors, for reasons that are still somewhat unclear, we don't like to do that around other people. So some of our most our best work, I would argue, in many disciplines is actually done alone. And any of you want to pick up on that in the Q&A, please feel free to. There's also being tested by mom or dad, or brother or sister around the breakfast table, right? They say uspracht, you say U-S-P-R-A-C-H-T. And then there's reading for fun, playing word games like Scrabble. Now, what do we find when these kids kept these logs of what they did and how they rated these activities? Well, the verbal leisure activities for this group was rated about as enjoyable as eating ice cream. That's the dark gray bar. So they're not normal children by any stretch of the imagination. And that's actually much more enjoyable than being tested by mom or dad. In turn, that's more enjoyable than doing deliberate practice. The pattern for how effortful is this activity is exactly the opposite. Verbal leisure activities are the least effortful. Being tested is more effortful, but the most effortful activity is deliberate practice. That leads us to the question of, well, what does determine their success in the spelling bee? And that's this graph. And I think the major take home from this graph is that grittier kids, that's in the top left, are more likely to do more hours of deliberate practice, which is why there's that solid arrow. That is, of all of the 3 practice activities, the only thing that reliably predicts how well you actually do in the finals. It doesn't matter how much you read for fun or how much mom or dad quiz you around the breakfast table. These activities are correlated, but really it's deliberate practice that leads to skill improvement. Interestingly, in this study, we measured another personality trait, and this is openness to experience. It's got a scale with items like, I really enjoy learning. I love to go to museums. I like learning just for learning's sake. I'm a curious person. I have a good imagination. Interestingly, in this study, if anything, there was an inverse correlation with performance. And you might be dismayed to learn that in many other studies, this kind of open to experience intellectual quality, which many of us, including me as a parent, hope that their children cultivate, is actually inversely or negatively predictive of objective measures of achievement. Why is an interesting question. It might be that there's something wrong with the way we measure achievement, or it may be other reasons. And again, I'm happy to discuss that more in the Q&A. One of the places that we've studied grit the longest is West Point Military Academy. It's well known perhaps for its kind of arduous, make 'em and break 'em kind of philosophy towards building soldiers. It graduates about 25% of the officers into the US Army every year. And you may know that the selection procedures, you think getting your kids into college is hard. West Point is a much more extensive admissions policy, and they take great pains to pick kids who they think A, can make it, and B, really belong there. Right? So they're not doing the aggressive marketing campaign of please come to West Point, please come to West Point. They know how hard it is. They know that there's a 5-year commitment to the military after you graduate. So they're trying not to select kids who are going to drop out. Every kid who drops out of the US Military Academy at West Point costs American taxpayers roughly $500,000 because those kids are not replaced. So every dropout is a dropout, and there is no coming into West Point in the 2nd year and the 3rd year and so on. So what do we find at West Point? Well, the way that we designed this study was to measure grit on day 2 of arrival. I think it's the day they shave all your hair off and check for tattoos. And what we were doing there is asking the question, can we predict retention through that first hard summer, the transition between civilian life and military life, where on average anywhere from 5 to 7% of West Point cadets drop out. Can we do that better than all the other things that West Point is already predicting or using to predict? And in particular, what we were trying to beat is something called the whole candidate score. This is West Point's proxy for talent. It's a weighted average of your SAT score, your high school rank, your leadership potential as rated by experts, and your physical aptitude. And this is what we found. Grit is in the dark blue line, and just for convenience sake, we broke up the scores into quintiles, or quartiles, so bottom 25% over here, top 25% of grit there, and on the y-axis there's the likelihood of retaining, of staying at West Point as opposed to dropping out. And what we found the first year that we did it, the second year that we did it, and in fact every year since then, and I think we're going on year 10, is that grit predicted who stayed at West Point through that first summer. In contrast, things like whole candidate score had sort of a strange relationship with retention. At least in this sample, the kids who are in the bottom 25% of whole candidate score don't stick around, but neither do those in the top 25%. And we've been working with other kinds of elite organizations who often find the same pattern. The kids who have the least ability, if you will, for whatever it is that that organization does, drop out, and that makes a lot of sense. But interestingly, there's a kind of fragility or vulnerability at the top as well. And again, you know, we're interested to know why. We're sort of raising more questions than we have answers for. But at any rate, talent here does not predict showing up in life. As Woody Allen famously opined in an interview with the New York Times, 80% of success in life is showing up. And if that is true, talent is not necessarily what gets you to show up. It may help you once you're there, but if you don't show up at all, you know, you're not in the game. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry, next slide, please. I'm saying that to you, but I have the count. That doesn't help. I'm like, next slide to myself. Okay, so where we're going now with West Point is trying to understand who are these gritty cadets and what makes them different. And just a little sneak peek into the research that we're just doing right now this year. Last summer, the cadets answered the grit scale. They answered all kinds of other scales that West Point also administers. And they also did an exercise in counterfactual thinking. Very simply, we asked them, oh, what else would you be doing right now if you were not at West Point? What's the counterfactual? What else could you be doing, right? And then the cadets had to rate themselves, you know, is this something which you would say is worse than being here? About the same, or actually better than being here at West Point. And predictably, most of the cadets said that, you know, what else they would be doing is worse. I mean, that makes sense. I was most interested in this group of cadets who said that they couldn't imagine another scenario. And what we find here is that the grittier the cadet, the more likely they either make a downward comparison, what else I would be doing here is not so great, or couldn't imagine anything at all. In longitudinal work, my money is on the can't imagine group to be the grittiest, and you know, and more gritty than these other two kinds of counterfactual thinkers. Here's what we found last summer. Grit again predicted retention, but not when you controlled for counterfactual comparison. In English, the idea is that if you are a gritty cadet, you are more likely to stay through the summer, perhaps because you're somebody who doesn't think about all the other things that they could be doing, right? Do I think that's all of grit? Absolutely not. But do I think it might be one element of what it is to be a gritty person? It is. And that's partly because, you know, being somebody who studies grit and achievement, I filter the entire world and everything I see through the lens of my research. So I have a keen eye out for every biography, every story of success or failure. And I've noted that some of the most successful individuals really do burn their bridges. You know, it's just this way or no way, and there's no contingency planning. There's no option B. There's no, well, what are the opportunity costs of what I'm doing versus what, it's just this way, and I can't imagine really anything worthwhile other than what I'm on this path. The downside of that is something that, again, happy to talk about in discussion. What does it mean to not have peripheral vision, and how could that potentially be a maladaptive thing in certain circumstances? At Teach for America, which is a terrific research partner of ours, they have this idea that relentless persistence, as they put it, is part of what makes a great teacher. They, you may know, recruit 22, 23, 24-year-old recent college graduates, and as well other kinds of sort of non-educators into education, and then they place those individuals into the nation's most impoverished schools. So you get these kids who are kind of faced with the kind of classroom management problems that frankly you'll never have at a school like this one, and they see how they'll do. And the idea is that, with this relentless persistence and, all the capacities that these young people bring, that they will, do a remarkable job in teaching. Well, when we partnered with Teach for America for this study, we were interested in whether the grittier Teach for America teachers were more effective over time than the less gritty teachers. And we were also interested in, again, what gives rise to grit, right? So in this study, we didn't study counterfactual thinking, we studied optimism. So optimism, as we define it in this study, is when something bad happens to you, do you spontaneously, optimistically think about specific changeable aspects of the situation? You come home and you got a C- on your math test. Do you think, okay, what specifically went wrong there? Like, why did I get those 4 problems wrong? What could I have done better? Or do you act like a pessimist? It's a catastrophe. I'm stupid. It's ruined. I'm going to fail math, and now I'm not going to go to college, right? Which, as I was telling the students, because I wanted to assure them, we've all done, right? So optimists do this too, they just do it less. And so the idea of having an optimistic explanatory style is to, on average, in general, tend to find specific changeable causes for bad events versus dwelling on stable, unchangeable global aspects of a situation. So what we found in Teach for America core members is that those who were more optimistic before entering the classroom were also grittier. And down here I have life satisfaction. So I want to put a little plug in for all the things that I don't study, like happiness. And happy teachers were also better performers. So grit predicted teaching effectiveness, as did happiness. Gritty, happy teachers had students who actually made greater academic gains over the school year than their less gritty, less happy peers. And optimism seemed to predict both grit and happiness. I had one of the students come up to me afterwards, and she actually had tears in her eyes. So I was wondering whether it was going to be a good comment or potentially a bad comment. And she said, that thing you said about optimism really spoke to me because for me, my mom, just made me think about optimism, and she taught me about this work, and she's been reading all these books, but really, when things are hard, it's actually what gets me through, is sort of, taking a deep breath and thinking about the specific things that I can do about the situation and not catastrophizing, which would be my tendency. So she was sort of saying, I think, in more eloquent words than anybody else could, what it means to have this kind of style in the face of adversity. And I do think it's very much about being a gritty person. So grit is not just about counterfactualizing in a certain way. It's not just about thinking optimistically, but it certainly is, I think, an important piece of the puzzle. The illusion that Lonnie made about choose easy, work hard, comes from this slide, which I also showed the students this morning. And I'll tell you the story about how I came to this little piece of advice. Now, I'm stretching a little bit beyond my data here. I haven't done a research study on choosing easy, working hard, but let me tell you how I got here. So I'm doing my work, and I'm trying to answer every email from every person who emails me and says that I'm interested in grit. And I'm not doing too good of a job of it, but one comes over the transom, and it really kind of spoke to me. It was a management consultant from McKinsey, where I used to work, who was having a midlife crisis in San Francisco. And he said, would you mind if I called you to talk to you about my career? So I was quick to point out that I'm not a clinical psychologist, and there are probably 1,000 people that he could call other than me would be better qualified, but he insisted, and I said, sure, I'm willing to have a conversation. I think I had special empathy for those people who went through the McKinsey experience like I did. And so I'm talking to him, and he's telling me about the lifestyle, and he's telling me about his biography, and it's typical McKinsey, like went to all the right schools, got all the best grades, got all the best scholarships, then got the best job, and is actually doing well at McKinsey, but feeling empty, like feeling like I'm not excited about this, isn't what I want to do, and frankly, I don't know where to go next. So I asked him some additional questions about what he liked, and what he was good at, and what he cared about, and then I asked him like the stupidest question, which is, well, why don't you do that? And there's this long pause, and he says, you know, it's a funny thing that I've kind of this rule in my head, which is always take the path of greatest resistance, right? Always do the hardest thing, always do what hurts, right? And I think what he had been talking about is essentially using the heuristic that deliberate practice, effort, challenge, confusion, anxiety, that's good. That's how you get better at things. And I was able to tell him that he had gotten half of the equation right? Which is, it's true that when you're doing things that hurt and are hard and that you can't do them, and you have to do it over and over and over again with feedback, that is how you get better, but that's once you've chosen what you've done. Now, the choosing part, you have exactly the opposite logic. And I was saying to the young people today, you know, when you go and pick your college or your boyfriend, I didn't say boyfriend because, you know, I thought I might get in trouble, but I said your major, but I would have said but if you're going to choose a life partner, I mean, don't choose the person to be with that it's like the hardest, you know, the most effortful, I've got to really pay attention, I got to improve. No, you want to choose easy, but believe me, as well as you choose, hard will come. You know, it'll be not smooth sailing. And it's the same thing for anything. Choose the sport that you like the most. Choose the thing that you enjoy and that nobody makes you do it. But once you've chosen that based on your interests, based on your talents, based on, you know, how you think about things that are valuable to you in the world, then work hard. Then seek out deliberate practice. Work to your edge. Seek out challenge. Look for where your skills fall short of the demands of the situation. Now, there's a little bit of jargon here, but I think it's important. I think that when we want to improve in something, we want to work on something that psychologists would say is within individual change. Me compared to yesterday, right? When you're choosing a career or choosing a profession, I think that's when we should be more sensitive to me relative to other people. Not me relative to yesterday, but me relative to her. Me relative to him. I think it's a natural comparison to be thinking about how do I stack up relative to the other people who are auditioning for this part when you're in the choosing stage. But then once you are, it's not helpful to be thinking about other people. It's more helpful to focus on you compared to yesterday and you compared to tomorrow. So I think shifting the framework, understanding that it's a two-stage process. There is choosing, and there is working. And I think sometimes we get caught in one or the other. I think sometimes people get stuck in working and they fail to recognize that they're really being faced with a choice. And I think also sometimes people who are in the work stage, they go back to the choice stage too much. So those undergraduates who leave Penn, where I teach undergraduates, who are constantly kind of flip-flopping, constantly like starting something but starting over, you know, engaging in something but then giving up. In a way, they're going back to the choice stage. They're sort of flitting back to, they need to stay in the work stage longer. So yes, it's a two-stage process, and yes, you might have to flip a little bit, but make sure you understand which stage you're in, and don't, you know, flip-flop too much. So that is the sort of piece of our research, a glimpse of the grit work that we're doing. Happy to say more about it in the Q&A, but before we get to that section of the program, I really wanted to talk about self-control too. Now, I am less well known for studying self-control, but I think it is just as important for success in life. And interestingly, we started off with a quote from Francis Galton, who said, well, here are the three things about really eminent individuals in society. There's talent, there's zeal, and there's a capacity for hard work, right? Then we talked about grit. Interestingly, in the same exact book, Francis Galton said, don't be confused. Eminence is not about resisting the hourly temptations. There's something very different that we need to sort of get by in life on a day-to-day basis when thwarted with everyday, hourly, minutely distractions and diversions and temptations. So it's not about staying the course over years. It's more about getting through shorter moments in time and not getting waylaid by things that tempt us. Now, in particular, I think that a definition of temptation would be more useful if we think about it this way. A temptation is something which is immediately pleasurable and rewarding, but soon after regretted. So, most of us would enjoy, eating a marshmallow. Well, not me, but 4-year-olds apparently are universally enthralled with eating marshmallows. But things like, oh yeah, well, I'll just go on Facebook for like 2 minutes. It feels good right away, not in 5 years, not in 5 minutes, but immediately. And all the temptations we can think of, like Doritos, Bravo Television, okay, now I'm being personal, Us Magazine, things that are, really fun right away. These are our temptations. Now, in some cases, the temptation is not really temptation because you can eat the marshmallow or watch the television and not feel regret. So that's fine, right? That's an indulgence. A temptation is something that you know you're going to regret almost at the moment that you're indulging in it. And I think that there's no human being that doesn't have their own Achilles heel. And this is why in cross-national research, when you give adults and children long inventories of good things, character strengths, kindness, generosity, sense of humor, forgiveness, on and on, and you include self-control, universally, across ages and across countries, individuals rank self-control as their weakest character strength. And I think it's because for all of us, there is some, battle within. Now, what do we know about self-control and temptation? Well, I took this little cartoon from an article that was written in the New Yorker about a famous marshmallow experiment that was done at Stanford in the 1960s by a young psychologist at the time named Walter Mischel. And it goes like this. You seat a little 4-year-old at a table in a room that has nothing else in it. And you first ask the 4-year-old what treats they like, and they get to pick. So they've now picked their favorite treat. And then you make a big pile and a little pile. For example, 2 marshmallows versus 1. And you explain to the 4-year-old the following very simple choice. Would you like the 2 or the 1? Universally, I've actually just studied a sample of 1,000 kids, and all 1,000 said 2, right? So we're all rational in that sense. But that's when the experiment begins. Right? So then the experimenter says, oh, great, you'd prefer the 2. Are you sure you'd rather have the 2 than the 1? And then the child says, yes. And then you say, well, if you're willing to wait for me to come back into the room because I have to get something, then you can have the 2 later. But if you can't wait, it's totally fine, and then you can just eat the 1 right away. How long are you able to delay gratification for something that you just said that you really wanted more than the smaller but more immediate tempting 1 marshmallow? Right? So that's the experiment. Now, the idea is older than Walter Mischel. It goes back to Freud, who had a theory of child development that went like this. As a child, we are just a bag of impulses, right? We do what we want to do exactly when we want to do it. But the challenge of maturation is to be able to delay the gratification of our impulses in an appropriate way so that we are, and society is, better off. Right? So the idea of Freudian delay of gratification was first successfully studied when someone figured out how to do a science experiment on it, and that is the marshmallow task. So what do we know about it? Well, one thing we know about it is very young children, as soon as they're able to articulate anything, are able to tell you what it feels like to have to use self-control. Here's Frog and Toad. For those of you who know this story, Frog and Toad make an enormous batch of chocolate chip cookies and have like a reptile binge on chocolate chip cookies, and they're eating the cookies like, oh, I feel sick, give me another one, and then they try to tie up the cookies in a box, but then they untie the box and put it up on a high shelf, but then they get it down. They say towards the end, willpower is trying hard not to do something that you really want to do. Right? And even 5-year-olds, 4-year-olds will kind of not, do you know what that's like when you do something and you know you shouldn't do it, but you so want to do it? They know as well as we do. A sharper definition that we use in the research literature is that self-control is acting in a way that is consistent with your global goals and values, your more abidingly, deeply held, goals and values in the face of smaller, more concrete, proximal rewards, or what Galton would say, the hourly temptations, the things that just in the moment that they're there are so alluring to us. The Princetonian philosopher Harry Frankfurt, whose work on bullshit you may have heard, has also written on self-control, and I like his definition. Self-control is choosing to act in accordance with your second-order desires, doing what you want yourself to want to do, versus what you merely first-order desire want to do, right? So how can we do that? Well, one thing is true. Some of us are better at it than others. In a 2011 sketch, Stephen Colbert decided to spoof the marshmallow task. I think in the sketch he eats that entire bag of marshmallows and starts dipping them in fluff, which was funny. I actually sent the video to Walter Mischel, who was not amused, but I found it funny. So it's clear that some of us are more self-controlled than others. By the way, why is a science experiment conducted in 1960 at Stanford being spoofed on Stephen Colbert? Why has it, Barack Obama actually talked about waiting for the second marshmallow in a presidential address. Sesame Street devoted a week of Elmo programming to, so Elmo had to save up for a shiny ball, and every day he got another $1, and the ball cost $5. Is he going to wait to get the ball at the end of the week, or is he going to spend his dollar right now, right here, on a smaller, less desired treat? Why is there this national attention? It's an interesting question, and I think it's in part because temptations have actually increased in their potency, their convenience, and their frequency for young people, and for all of us, right? It's not a surprise that we're all gaining weight. We did not evolve as a species to have high calorie, high fat, high sugar, high sodium snacks, 15 inches away from us at all times for almost free, right? So temptation is on the rise, I think, which is why awareness of self-control and its importance is also on the rise. So some children are better at self-control than others. What do we know from research? In a study that I'm doing on a national data set of children who were given the delay of gratification task when they were 4 years old and then followed all the way through till their late teens, we know that how long you can delay gratification predicts your standardized achievement test scores, more or less like the SAT, your grade point average from your high school records, self-reported risky behavior, and a lower, healthier BMI, basically being leaner and physically healthier in late adolescence. And in that study in particular, I was wondering, well, maybe delay of gratification, even though Freud and Walter Mischel thought of it as something very separate from intelligence, maybe just the smart kids, figured out somehow how to delay gratification. So in that study, intelligence was also measured at age 4, and there were ratings of self-control, or what's called effortful control in the childhood literature, by the teachers in the preschool programs where these kids were students, or other caregivers and mothers. And what we find in that study is, yes, delay of gratification predicts those things. It is, in most cases, not because of intelligence. It's because, or statistically, it's because the ratings of self-control. So yes, this is a self-control test. It is not an IQ test. And that's sort of explaining all these good outcomes later in life. The only outcome for which you can make a claim about intelligence really being what's at play here is standardized achievement test scores. And I'll say a little bit more about them because they're such a big part of our kids' lives in a moment. So as I was saying, I think, I am no student of history, but I think temptations are on the rise. If you pit something like algebra homework against Angry Birds, who wins, right? What is more immediately rewarding? There is a question here. By the way, my children thought that I should update this because Angry Birds apparently is very 2011, and it should be Where's My Water or something else, but you get the point. I think that the words of Aristotle say it best. The roots of education are bitter in the moment, but the fruit, which does not get born for quite some time, is sweet, right? The roots right here and right now are bitter. The fruit is sweet, and therefore it's hard to avoid temptations like Angry Birds. In a study that we're doing of kids who wore wristwatches for an entire week and were randomly beeped 56 times during that week, during waking hours, and asked to fill out this very long form about what they were doing at the moment and how they were feeling, we found the following. Now, these are kids aged about 11 through 18. They were, in fact, in 6th grade, 8th grade, 10th grade, and 12th grade at 10 different sites in the United States. What we find is that girls, boys, 6th graders, 12th graders, rich, poor, black, white, and everything in between, A students, F students, all say that what I'm doing right now is really important to my own personal future goals if it is something like homework or studying, taking a test or a quiz, doing work in class, or listening to my teacher lecture. And in fact, by far the most important activities, judged by kids of all stripes, relative to anything else. I'm playing sports, I'm reading for fun, I'm talking with my family, I'm talking with my friends, I'm eating a meal, I'm sleeping, I'm resting, I'm waiting to do something, I'm doing my housework, I'm playing games, I'm watching TV. In contrast, the roots are bitter. Are you happy right now? Here are the same academic activities, below the mean consistently. Everything else is more fun. So that's, I think, why children need self-control. Because even if you care about your college education, and frankly, even if you care about math or you're interested in science, that there will be, inevitably, reliably, temptations that are more fun in the moment to allure you. We find in our research that self-control, or here we call it self-discipline, is a terrific predictor of things like report card grades. In this particular study of 8th graders, if you're in the top 20% of self-control, you actually get better grades than the kids who are in the top 20% of IQ, which is still a good predictor, but not as good a predictor as self-control. We also found in the same data set, and we're finding this over and over again, interestingly, that girls are getting better grades than boys, in part because they are more self-controlled. Now, throughout development, it's been well known that girls mature faster in a number of different dimensions. It turns out that their brains mature a little faster, they grow a little faster. Now, boys eventually catch up, I think. I'm not entirely sure. At least that's what we're told. But throughout development, say for example, the sample of 8th graders, girls have better control over their attention, better control over their behavior, to some extent better control over their emotions, their temper, and so forth. Now, when I first analyzed the data, I wasn't surprised that girls would have an advantage in self-control, that arrow would be there and significant. I also knew that self-control would have an effect on grades, but frankly, I had never heard about girls doing better on the report cards. The only thing I had heard growing up is that boys beat us on our SAT scores, and they beat us on our AP test scores. And in fact, that's true. And still true, less and less true over time, but still true today. So I didn't know about this arrow here, that girls actually got better grades. I actually called the Philadelphia School District where I was doing the research, and I said, I think you gave me the wrong data because, I mean, even in the math classes, the female students get better grades. And the person on the other end of the line said, oh, no, I've been in this job a long time, and that's true at every grade, in every school, in every subject. I did a literature search, and that's true nationally as well. It's true in college. It's true for the STEM careers of science, technology, engineering, and math. I don't think it's very publicized, but I think for those of us who have girls, we should start publicizing it. And I think that what we're seeing in our research data is that if you have an advantage in self-control, it disproportionately rewards you on things like report card grades. It may not show up as well on things like the SAT or the standardized tests that are given in public schools every year. And I have an explanation for that. Before I do give you why I think it is that girls are excelling boys in their course grades, but not on standardized tests of achievement, I just want to explain to you that, that girls are getting better grades not because they're goody two-shoes, not because they're there to please people more, not because they say that school is more interesting or more important. When we measure both self-control and student motivation, how interesting schoolwork is, how important is it to me, how much I value it, how well I want to do this year. The effect of school motivation on grades when you put everything else in is 0. So girls are getting better grades and in fact improving their grades over time because they are more self-controlled and working harder, not because they just simply care more. Now here's my answer to the why is it that the self-control helps you on your grades, but not your standardized achievement test scores. This is a figure that I actually made in part to write a paper called What No Child Left Behind Leaves Behind. And in part because I knew that I was going to have an opportunity to present to Arnie Duncan at the Department of Education. And I think he gave me all of like 7 minutes to summarize everything that I knew in social science that would be relevant to education. So I had to choose carefully, and I thought, what is one thing that I would want the Secretary of Education to know? So I showed him this slide, and I said, you know, what we're measuring in kids these days, right? SAT scores, high stakes tests, they're all versions of standardized achievement tests. And why do we do that? Well, they're apples to apples comparisons of skills and knowledge that kids are supposed to acquire in school, right? Fine, fair enough. That's what they're designed to do, and to some extent, that's what they do. But I think that those tests actually also pick up skills and knowledge that were not formally taught to children, that they did not have homework assignments and projects on. As a math teacher in a public school in San Francisco, I would, after administering the standardized California test, peek and realize, to my shock and dismay, that there were problems on that test that I did not explicitly teach my kids. And I think that the more intelligent kids figured it out, right? They figured it out. They were watching things outside of class. They sort of figured it out on the spot. Intelligence disproportionately benefits you on these tests, in part because it helps you acquire knowledge just, you know, as you're going about in life. Self-control, in contrast, helps you more on the things that you are given structured opportunities for. Now, I'm not making an argument here that that these streams of, you know, acquiring information and knowledge outside of school, you know, I'm not saying that they're not important. I didn't tell Arnie Duncan you shouldn't have any standardized tests. What I wanted to emphasize is that it's an incomplete picture of student competence. At a minimum, could we look at their attendance record, their teacher ratings of behavior, their grade point average for policy decisions, and then, since I had the floor, I said, what about honesty, empathy, kindness, social intelligence, generosity? I mean, I think we care about those. So No Child Left Behind certainly leaves those competencies behind as well. You know, he nodded, so I'm not sure how much, you know, of an impression I made. Now, for those of us who have kids who exist in the real world, there is such a thing as uncontrollable circumstances that just happen to them, and there's nothing they can do about it, and oftentimes there's nothing we can do it as parents. What I'm talking about are stressful life events, right? Parent loses a job, marriage is breaking up, sister has an eating disorder, brother's going through a hard time, best friend moves away, we moved across town. Those kinds of negative life events that are very stressful for kids, and frankly, you know, they're beyond their control. I mean, they sort of happen to them. What is the effect of those kinds of negative life events on child self-control? Here's what we find in study after study after study. We were inspired to do this work in part from animal experiments. In a laboratory, you're able to shock rats and, you know, poke them and, you know, create stress. And in those laboratory studies, they've been finding changes in the brain structures of those animals, and also behavioral changes that look like the rat form of impulsivity. Right? So the rat form of having low self-control. We find the same thing in real kids, in the real world. When they experience negative life events, they feel stressed out. They answer questions like, I feel like I can't handle what's going on in my life. I feel like I'm helpless and out of control. And that leads to changes in their self-control over time. So I only wanted to include that one slide to say that of the many things that we should be thinking about, we should be very sensitive to the circumstances that our kids are going through. And if we see kind of a temporary change in their behavior that seems uncharacteristic, it may be a reaction to this kind of, you know, immediate environment. Now, I think this kind of behavior, though maladaptive, of course, is in a way rational in the following sense. As a species, we evolved to be able to act impulsively and quickly in circumstances where the world was very uncertain. If the world is going to hell, eat dessert right now. Take the first marshmallow. Who knows what's coming down the line, right? Don't plan for the future. You don't even know if the future is going to be here, right? He hits you, hit him back, right? Now, in modern times, that kind of impulsive reactivity is not adaptive. But it makes sense to me that as an organism, we evolved to have certain systems to act quickly, to act impulsively, and that when we perceive that that's the environment in which we are now in, those get very activated. And the overriding kind of control processes become weakened. The good news is that in most of our research, when we follow these kids over time, when the negative life circumstances go away, the behavior comes back to baseline. And that's encouraging. What we want to watch out for are the kids who are chronically stressed. For example, very low-income kids, but also high-income kids too. So when the chronic stress is there, there can be enduring effects on self-control. Now, the most important part of the talk, I think, is what you might do with all of this in your own lives and then with your kids. And so I want to say something about 2 strategies in particular that research suggests are very helpful for self-control and to some extent potentially for grit, though it hasn't been directly studied. So this is not a typo. This is the Greek root word for strategy. Does anyone know what strategia means, classics majors? Anyone? It's the Greek word for general, military general. And the idea of a strategy is you have a certain amount of resource, right, as William James would have put it. You have 100 soldiers. Strategy is, where do you put them? Now, I can't change your kids' brains very easily, and I certainly can't change their DNA. But what are they going to do with those resources? Where are they going to place their soldiers? Kids can do things in strategic ways that make self-control easier. Contrary-wise, they can actually blunder into situations using the very strategy that makes self-control and willpower the hardest of all. So, for example, in strategies that increase self-control or facilitate it, what kids can do is increase the salience and the expected value of the global valued goal, right? If they can make really present and clear to them in the moment what it is that they're wanting to want to do, that will help them act with self-control. They can also try to decrease the salience and the value of the sort of proximal tempting reward, right? And I think that's how self-control strategies of various kinds, I'm going to talk about 2 in particular here, all work. I'm going to skip that slide. We can come back to it. But let me just get right into one random assignment experiment that we did. There is a strategy of psychological distance that reduces the salience of temptation. Here, the temptation is to indulge in a temper outburst, indulge in our anger. It feels weird to say indulging in anger. How is indulging in anger anything like eating the first marshmallow? Well, it's not exactly pleasurable, but it's some kind of release. And it sure feels better to lose your temper in the moment of anger than it does to, act with restraint and reflection. So here we were wondering whether kids who were recalling an angry memory in 5th grade were able to psychologically distance themselves from that angry memory, thereby reducing the salience of that temptation and increase their self-control over their emotions. Here's how we did it. 5th graders are asked to remember something that happened to them reasonably recently that made them mad, right? Anger is the emotion which is given to the appraisal that your rights have been wronged. Apparently, all 5th graders in this country have recently been wronged because they're like, oh yeah, it didn't take much. So there's all kinds of injustice being carried out today in American schools. But anyway, they remember this angry event, and half of the kids remember it the way we all remember spontaneous memories like that. They replay the event as it unfolded in their imagination through their own eyes, right? First person. Half of the kids were randomly assigned to replay the event as it unfolds in your imagination as you observe your distant self. So, and then we had a little bit of elaboration, like you're watching yourself. It's like you're there, but you're kind of watching yourself there. It's like a third person perspective on the same memory. So that simple little manipulation resulted in this. Then when asked about the negative affect that they were feeling, feelings of angry, hostility, sadness, and so forth, those who were in the distance condition were dramatically better at regulating that negative emotion compared to those who were left to be in the immersed condition. And importantly, what you were able to do in that, distance condition was to really pay attention to the information in the encounter, to actually think about what was going on, not just react emotionally, and to make fewer blame attributions. So it's much less like, well, they did this and I, and they're sort of against me, but just, thinking about things in a much more even-handed, empathic way. Psychological distancing actually goes all the way back to the marshmallow study in the following way. What Walter Mischel found is that if children did certain manipulations that made the marshmallow more psychologically distant, they were dramatically better at waiting for it. For example, he would, in some conditions, ask children, well, if you want to, when you want to, while you're waiting, you can do this. You can just, pretend it's a picture. It's pretty hard for us, but they're 4, they pretend things are things all the time. And so when you do this, oh yeah, if you want to, when you want to, you can pretend it's a picture. Children were able to wait twice or more as long. Likewise, if you ask children, oh, if you want to, when you want to, you can pretend the marshmallow is like a cloud. It's puffy and white. Versus encouraging kids to think about it, but if you want to, when you want to, while you're waiting, you can think about how if you get, both marshmallows, they're yummy, sticky, and sweet, right? So again, distancing ourselves, it's the same thing. It's a marshmallow or it's an angry memory, but is there some way where we can extract ourselves from the situation, pull back a bit, and make that temptation less hot? The next strategy that, and the second and probably the most relevant strategy that I can share with you from our research is something called MCII. Now, it really goes back to the research of 2 NYU researchers named Gollitzer and Ettingen. They're worth a good Google. And I'm going to walk you through what is essentially a goal setting and planning strategy that works miracles with kids and with grown-ups alike. So when I walk you through this, I want you to do it for yourself. Okay? Now, we've all set goals before. Our bosses want us to set goals. Our spouses want us to set goals. Kids' teachers want us to set goals. But for most of us, this process has been incomplete. You set a goal, and then you're done. That's it. This is what it really should look like. In mental contrasting, the first thing that you do is you set a goal, hopefully a specific goal. Right? Specific goals are much more easy to execute than global goals. Because, if I just say, next year I want to be a better student at North Shore, you'll never know when exactly you haven't been a better student because it's too vague, right? If you say, what I mean by being a better student is, I want to pay attention in all of my history classes, and by that I mean, I always want to be looking at the teacher when they're talking, then you get feedback on when you're actually not achieving that goal. So you first set a very specific, tangible goal. Then you ask, what good thing will happen if I achieve this goal? This is called a positive fantasy. And, in the case of a child saying, like, they really want to pay attention in history class, it could be, well, the good thing will be that they'll get a better grade on the history test. Now, you can get more romantic and ideal, like, knowledge, I will be a better person. But the key is that the kid has to, or you have to think about why it is that you have certain goals. So actually, for a moment, just to yourself, please, if you could think of one goal that you have not made progress on in the last, say, weeks or months that you wish you had made progress on, anything, exercise, eating, work, your relationships. If you think about one specific thing, and then you think about what good thing would happen if you actually got that goal to come about, then I want you to do what nobody likes to do, which is to seriously consider the negative reality. So in contrast to the positive fantasy, what is the negative reality that stands in the way? What is the obstacle? There's probably not one obstacle, there are probably many, and you can rattle off as many as you want in your head. And when we work with children, we let them tell us everything they want, but we don't let them stop telling us about obstacles until they find one which they can do something about. And this is crucial. If they cannot, after much consternation, think of a single thing that they could possibly impact, then we actually essentially bracket the conversation and come back to it later. Because there's no way to get kids to work on something if they themselves can see no way out of it. Now, that almost never happens. Eventually, you get to something like, well, I guess I could not sit next to my best friend who I like talking to in history class. Then that leaves you open to the implementation intention part, the planning part of the strategy. That's when you make a little plan to avoid or overcome the obstacle. And again, it's child-driven, or in this case, self-driven, right? So you make a plan. What is something that you could do to obviate or overcome an obstacle that stands in the way of this goal? Now, when we do this with kids, we use a little worksheet, and we make sure that they know that there's an if blank, then blank. And there's something about the syntax of this kind of plan which is dramatically more effective than, oh yeah, I'm going to go to the bedroom and do my work around 6 on a weekday. It's much better to say if cue, then action. And when we coach kids on this, we make sure that the action really is a specific action verb, right? I'll go to my bedroom and do my work, and that the if part has a cue which is inevitable. So oftentimes kids will say, if I feel like it, I will go to my bedroom and do my work. And I'm like, okay, that's great, but what we mean is, if cue, something that you know is going to happen, and then they're able to say, okay, well, I know it's going to be Wednesday, and I know it'll be around dinner, and that's when I want to do it. And we have them mentally visualize it, we have them write it down, we have them say it out loud. And when they do that little exercise, this is a study that we did with 5th graders in Harlem. They were 5th graders who were reading at a 3rd grade level, and yet they were able to master this exercise. It only took about 45 minutes of coaching with some follow-up. That in the MCII condition, we were able to improve grades over the course of a marking period by a half standard deviation. Same for teacher ratings of student conduct. Teachers were blind to condition. They didn't know what kids were taught. And same thing for objective measures like attendance. Right? By the way, the control condition, the kids were encouraged to do goal setting, but all they did was positive fantasy. I was really happy when I walked into the door of the school and it said something like, deserve your dream. Because usually when I walk into a school, I see that poster of a ballerina that says, if you dream it, you can achieve it. It's all positive fantasy. It's like, if you just have high expectations, poof, you're a ballerina, I'm pretty sure that just dreaming it does not lead to playing piano like that, right? So what has to happen is that, okay, first I dream it, then I think about the positive fantasy, then I think about the obstacles that stand in the way, then I make a plan, then I try to execute my plan. And an important part of this study, and I think this is another important take-home for you and then for your children, is that it has to be iterative. Most plans don't work the first time. They need to be revised. So it's important to make sure that your student, your children, that they don't think, well, I tried this plan, it didn't work, now I'm done, it can't be done. No, most plans don't work, so what you need to do is every day check in with the plan and see whether it worked or not, evaluate it, and then go back to the beginning. Very much like deliberate practice. You get feedback, you start over again, right? With that feedback, what am I going to do differently? I want to end with a quote from William James. In a series of lectures that William James delivered, which he called Talks to Teachers. And he was addressing school teachers, much like I am, a psychologist talking to educators, a psychologist talking to parents. He said something, I think, quite profound. He said, virtues are habits as much as our vices. Our nervous systems grow to the way in which they are exercised, just as a sheet of paper or a coat once creased or folded tends to fall forever afterward into the same identical folds. Grit and self-control are very much like habits. There is some stability and momentum to them, but I do believe they can be learned, practiced, reinforced, and eventually cultivated in the way that William James says that we can cultivate our habits. And finally, I want to end with another Will quote, but it's a little more fun. He's been quoted as saying, I consider myself to be of basically average talent. The key to life is on a treadmill. When I say I'm going to run 3 miles, I run 5. With that mentality, it's actually difficult to lose. While the other guy's sleeping, I'm working. While the other guy's eating, I'm working. While the other guy's making love, I'm also making love, but I'm working really hard at it. Okay, let's end there and take some questions. Thank you very much for your attention.